everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. So today I want to do a fun little numbery video. I know I said I wasn't going to focus on numbers in the new year in my reading goals video, but I thought it would be interesting to go over my stats and my reading for the past year. So I recently discovered this little tool on bookriot. I was scrolling through bookriot's articles and they have this thing called the reading log, which is basically this fancy Excel sheet or Google Sheets sheet that lets you put in all of the books that you've read and kind of different stats about them, and then it compiles these pie charts and kind of stats on your reading for the year. So they have one for 2020, so I'm planning to use that when I start reading in 2020, but I kind of did a little thing where I altered the formulas so that I could input my reading from this year and kind of get a sense of the kinds of books that I've been reading and how I've been reading and just, you know, different perspectives on my reading this year. It proved to have a lot of interesting results. It took me a long while to input all of the information, but it was a lot of fun finding out the results at the end. So I'm going to be going through the different pie charts and stats that I ended up getting from this sheet. I will link the reading log that I put all this information in the description down below so you guys can go check it out. It'll be a read only so that you can just kind of look at it and see the stats and all of that I talk about in this video. And then I will also link the 2020 template that bookriot has so that you can use that if you want to in the new year. I know I'm going to be using it and I'm just really excited about it. So yes. I also feel like this is the kind of content that only I will really enjoy. So most of you will be like, why is she talking about a bunch of numbers about her reading? No one really cares. I do. I think it's kind of cool, so we're just gonna roll with it. So I will try to put up the pie charts and the stats over here so you can kind of see and understand what I'm talking about while I'm talking about it. I have my laptop here, my good enough sticker, bam. Okay, so basically in the chart that you can see, you are able to put in like the title of the book, the author, the publisher, and then you can put in the start and end date of when you read it, whether you DNF'd it, pages, the format that you read it in. So at first I started putting that in as the format that I had, but later I realized that I wanted to record what kind of format I was actually reading it in, because a lot of times I had a physical copy, but I was actually reading it through the audiobook, so I wanted that to be reflected in the chart. So I changed that halfway through as I was inputting them, and then I went back and changed the previous ones. And then the source that you got it from, so if you previously owned it, or if you bought it this year, or if you received a review copy. So there's some interesting stats about that. And then retail source, fiction versus nonfiction, form, so prose, play, poetry, that kind of thing, genre, audience, own voices, POC, LGBTQIA, creator, gender, reread, translation, nation of origin, reason for reading, days read, pages per day, and time per day. I started putting in my ratings at the beginning, but then I was like, I don't really care, so I just left that part blank for the rest of them. So I'm basically gonna go through all the pie charts that were formed from all the formulas from the sheet and talk about my reading, because I feel like I've had a weird reading year, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of different factors, to be honest. My channel got a lot bigger this year. I was doing a lot of reading for my Epic Book Recs series on the Epic Reads channel, and I was also, you know, reading for school as well. But then I was done school, and so I was reading a lot of different things. And I also got a lot busier in the last half of the year, so my reading kind of suffered for that. So it's been a weird year. So I'm gonna try and pinpoint the reasons for some of these stats, but also I'm just interested to see what kind of reading I've been doing. The first chart that we have is the finished versus DNF. So this is unsurprising. The total read is 98% and the total DNF is 1%. I think I DNF'd like one book, which probably speaks to my enjoyment of my reading this year. I really didn't DNF books that I really wanted to, and I feel like my reading suffered because of that. So the one book I remember DNFing was Wilder Girls by Rory Power, which I really just wasn't feeling like. I got 200 pages into it, didn't feel like I connected to any of the characters, so I DNF'd it, and that's the reason for that. I do hope in the new year that if I ever pick up a book that I'm not feeling, I will just DNF it so that I don't keep slogging through books that I don't like. The next chart is fiction versus nonfiction, which is another unsurprising one. So fiction is 98.8% and nonfiction is 1.2. I think I've only read like maybe 2 nonfiction books this year, and I think one of them was The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. I didn't read a lot of nonfiction. I did read a lot more nonfiction last year, I do recall. So I'm hoping to read more nonfiction in the new year. So yeah, that's one I want to work on. Okay, the next one I thought was really interesting. So this is format. So out of the 3 categories, which is print, audiobook, and digital meaning like ebook. So 54% of the books I read were on print, and then 40% were audio, and 4.9% were digital. So I did read a few books on ebook, namely I think like The Cruel Prince, The Wicked King. There was a couple other, Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist I remember reading on ebook. And then for audio, I read so much on audio this year. And this is coming from someone who really didn't like audiobooks until like maybe mid last year when I started using them, and they just changed my life. And I think a lot of the reading that I did get done this year was only thanks to audiobooks, because this whole year I feel like I haven't been liking reading as much, or wasn't reading things that I really enjoyed. And so having the audiobook to kind of get me through it and keep my interest was really huge for me. But I do also think that my reading did suffer a little bit from reading a lot of things through the audiobook, because at times if I wasn't really into a book and I was listening to it via the audiobook, then I found my interest kind of waning even more. And so it was like a double-edged sword. I feel like for books that I was interested in, it really worked. For ones that I wasn't super interested in, it either helped me get through it, or I just continued to kind of let it become background noise while I was doing something else, which is really bad. So yeah, but ultimately I still read most of my books through the print versions, through the actual physical copies, which I thought was interesting. I feel like in previous years it would have been more close to 100% for print and then like very little on the other ones. I also didn't usually read a lot of ebooks, so even that 5% is a lot. I feel like I'm hoping to increase that in the new year. I'm hoping to read more books via ebook and e-reader, because I do have an e-reader. I do like not owning physical copies for books that I'm not super into, so I'm hoping to increase that number in the new year and also have less print physical copies. The next chart is for audience, so adult versus YA versus middle grade. So I don't think I read any middle grade this year, which is unfortunate, and I really did intend to. I namely really wanted to get to Arsha and the Song of Death, which is the second Arsha book, but I didn't get to it this year, so hopefully next year. But unsurprisingly, 75% of the books that I read were YA, and then 25% were adult, which is something that I expected. I read a lot of YA this year. I was also reading a lot of YA because of my Epic Book Recs series. That series is focused on YA, so I wasn't gonna, you know, go out of my way to pick up an adult book to put on that series. So that was also part of the reason why I was reading a lot of YA, because I do feel like if it was up to me, I would have read more adult. So I'm really hoping to increase the number of adult books that I read in 2020 and maybe get it to like a 60-40 or a 50-50 even. That's kind of ambitious, but I'm hoping. Okay, the next one I think is super interesting is form. So as I said, for the first half of 2019, or the first 4 months, I was still in school. I was in my last semester of university, so I was still reading books for school, which included a bunch of plays, because there was a certain class that I was in at the time where we were reading tragedies, and most of those ended up being like tragedies in play form. So as you can tell from the chart, I read 70% prose, 11% plays, 1.2 in short story collections, 12% in comics, which includes manga. That's where I was putting the manga, and then 3.7% in poetry. So I don't think I read a lot of poetry. I think there's like maybe 2 collections or something that I picked up. Prose, obviously all the novels that I've been reading are prose, but yeah, a bunch of plays that I read in the first 4 months of the year. And then I don't even remember what short story collection I read. Oh, I think it was Black Enough. Yes, that was a short story collection. That was really good, actually. And then comics, obviously I read a bunch of manga earlier in the year and not so much towards the second half. I do want to change that. So I'm hoping to get more of a variance in my reading, maybe get it to a 60-40, so 60 prose, 40 a bunch of other things. I do want to read more poetry. I do want to read more graphic novels and manga. And I do want to continue with the plays, because I did really enjoy a lot of those plays I read for that class. So if anyone has any good recommendations for plays that they like, leave them down below. They don't have to be tragedies, just any plays. Okay, the next chart is for genre, which I thought was super interesting and really weird for me this year. So if you know me personally, or if you have been following my channel, you might know that my favorite genres are actually sci-fi and fantasy. But this year, the #1 genre that I read this year was general fiction. So like contemporary, basically. 44% of the books I read this year were general fiction. And I will say that that is 100% due to the fact that I was doing this Epic Book Recs series, and at the beginning we were keeping it a contemporary series. And so I read a ton of contemporary, YA contemporary in particular. I read a bunch of that at the beginning of the year and like in the middle of the year for that series. And so I read a lot more contemporary than I usually would, which I feel like is another reason why I didn't really enjoy my reading this year, because I wasn't reading a lot of my favorite genre. But on the other hand, I will say that I'm happy I kind of branched out of my usual genres this year and that I was reading more widely. I just hope I can do that more widely in like other genres, not just contemporary, YA, that kind of thing. The second biggest genre that I read was obviously fantasy. It was 22%, and then it was 9% for sci-fi, and then I have a lot of little ones, so 11% classics, which is because of that class I was taking and all of the tragedies that we read. And then I've got 1.2% business self-help, 1.2% horror, 6.2% mystery and crime, which there's a few mystery books that I read that were not, like they were YA mysteries kind of thing, and then 3.7 romance. All right, the next one here is pub date. So books published this year in 2019 versus books published before that. So 55% of the books that I read this year were actually backlist titles. They were not new releases, which I think is actually a really good number. The percentage of books that I read that were published this year was 44%. So I feel like I did get to a lot of new releases, but a lot of them were new releases that I read for my Epic Book Recs series and not specifically books that I was like excited about previously. So I didn't get to a lot of my new releases that I wanted to get to, but I did end up reading a lot of books that came out this year. I do hope to get to more backlist titles in the next year. I do want to get it to more 60-40, I would think, less new releases, because I do feel like, especially with series, I like it better when there are multiple books in the series out and I can kind of just binge read them. So I'm hoping to do that more next year. The next chart is book source, which I also think is pretty interesting. So 34% of the books that I read this year were purchased this year, that I bought this year. 37% of them were review copies, so books that were sent to me by publishers. So a lot of those were the books sent to me by the Epic Reads team for the Epic Book Recs series. And then 22% was from my own TBR, so books that I already owned on my shelves. And then 3.7% was borrowed, so just borrowed from friends or other people. And then 2.5% was from the library, which is a sad amount, and I really want to get that up next year. So I think for next year, I really do want to increase the number of books that I read from my own TBR to a lot bigger, and also books from the library to a lot bigger. And I want to get that purchased TBR to way down low. Like, it was way too much. It was 34%. I'm hoping to get it down to like maybe 10%, because I really don't want to be buying a lot of books next year. Okay, the next chart is a bar graph of the books finished per month. So in January, I finished 12 books. In February and March, I finished 11. In April, I finished 5. In May, I finished 4. In June, I finished 3. In July, I went back up to 10, which was great. In August, I went to 6. In September, I had a measly 2. In October, I read 7. In November, I finished 6. And in December, as of today when I'm filming this, I have read so far 3 books this month. So my reading kind of went up and down this year. As per usual, I read the most in January. I think that happens to me every year. I always end up reading the most in January, just because I feel like I have a lot more free time in January. There's less like family gatherings as there is in December. School and work are usually pretty chill in January, so I always end up having a lot more free time in January, and I end up reading a lot more. I don't know how my reading's gonna be in 2020 January, just because I feel like I want to focus on writing, but we'll see how that goes. And then in February and March, I also read a lot, and once again, I was still in school, so I still had quite a bit of time to read, which was totally awesome. And then April, May, and June, I had really bad reading months. Well, not super bad, but like pretty bad for me. And that's mainly because I had just graduated and I was really busy. I was working most of the time and I had a lot of like family life things happening, so I just didn't have enough time to read. July, things calmed down a lot for me, so I was reading a lot. I was just kind of going to work and reading, and that was really great. September was my worst reading month just because I was starting a new job, so I was working like multiple jobs at once, and I just didn't have enough time basically for myself, let alone to read. So that is a big reason why I only read 2 books that month, which is so sad for me. And then October and November, I did a little bit better. I'm hoping to read a lot more this December, but we will see how how that one goes. But overall, I feel like I didn't read as much as I wanted to this year, so hopefully that will change next year. Okay, the next chart is author, artist, gender. I read 75% female authors, which is not surprising. I read a lot of YA, and YA has a lot of female authors in them. I read 24% male authors, and then I read 1%, which was actually just one book by a non-binary author. It was I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver. It was a really incredible book about being a non-binary person. The main character is going through their coming out journey and dealing with their family's perspectives on things, and it was just a really good read. So I do recommend that if you're looking for a book with a non-binary protagonist. There was also another book that I read called Mooncakes. It was a graphic novel, and it did feature a non-binary protagonist. They were one of two protagonists. The next 4 charts here are ones that I kind of want to talk about, and although I feel like these charts have improved this year, they definitely aren't as good as I wanted them to be, and they definitely aren't as good as I thought they were, actually. So they are the POC versus white authors, POC versus white protagonists, and then queer versus non-queer authors, and queer versus non-queer protagonists. For POC authors versus white authors, I read 65% white authors and 35% POC authors, people of color. And this was kind of surprising to me because I thought I was doing a really good job of picking out books by people of color, and I was really happy about that. And I do think that number has gone up since previous years. I do feel like in previous years I read a lot of books by white authors, but this year I made a conscious effort to pick up a lot of contemporaries by people of color, so that was really great. But I feel like in the end the market is just so saturated by white authors. I still wasn't picking up as many books by people of color as I wanted to, which is kind of upsetting to me as a person of color, but 2020 is a new year, and I really do hope to change that stat to be more of a 50-50 or even a 60-40, so 60% people of color and 40% white authors, just because I really do care about representation. I do care about seeing other perspectives, and I do feel like part of the reason why there's such a skew is because I do read a lot of YA, and although there are a lot of new diverse voices in YA, there's still a lot of predominantly white voices. So I do want to change that. I do want to read more books from other countries of origin, so I am definitely hoping to change that. And then when it comes to queer authors and protagonists, the stat gets even worse, which I was expecting. I knew it wasn't going to be as high as the POC one because I was focusing on finding books by POC authors more. But I do want to change this in the new year. So for non-queer authors, I have 90% and 10% by queer authors. And then for queer protagonists, I have 77% books with no queer protagonists, and 22.5% of the books I read were books with queer protagonists. So obviously the stat kind of skews when it comes to protagonists because a lot of non-queer authors also write about queer protagonists, which is great. Still, writing about characters that are different from you is amazing and, you know, good. But I do want to increase the number of queer authors that I seek out and read, so definitely want to change that as well. I also want to get that intersection with, you know, queer people of color writing their stories. I do want to read more of those as well. So yeah, those 4 charts there kind of like were a punch to the gut a little bit. They made me kind of sad, but I'm gonna make them better in the new year. But I do think I did a pretty good job of, you know, seeking out more books with people of color and queer protagonists this year. I just didn't do as great as I hoped I would. So yeah, but those are basically all of these stats that I wanted to talk about and that I kind of got from this reading log. I hope this video was semi-interesting to some of you. I know I found it interesting to see what kind of reading I did this year, and I am so interested to see how it's going to be next year. So I'm definitely going to be using this reading log in the next year and, you know, inputting all of these stats and everything to see what kind of pie charts I'll have next year. So I will definitely do like a look back, I guess, next year at the end of the year of my 2020 reading and how it compares to this year's reading, because I think that would be super interesting. But if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up so I know you kind of like this weird statty content. I know I cared about it, but I highly doubt any of you did, but that's totally fine. But for those of you who kind of do like this stuff, if you want to input your own stats, definitely go take a look at the templates down below and you can kind of input your own reading and see how it fared this year. I think it's super, super interesting to kind of know what kind of reading you're doing, make conscious efforts for certain kinds of things, because I know we all read for enjoyment, but I do think to a certain extent you can be very conscious about the things you're reading and consuming and the art what you are letting inform your life. Let me know down below if any of you do try the reading log and what kind of stats you come up with. And if you know any of your stats, let me know. I would be really interested. If you think any of your stats were kind of comparable to me, or if you thought any of my stats were kind of interesting, let me know. I would love to hear all of your thoughts. But I will see you in my next video. So thank you so much for watching, and please remember that the story ain't over. Bye!